Welcome, everybody, to the Surrey Brewery Opportunity Market Insights and Intelligence webinar. I'm Elizabeth. I'm with the city's Economic Development Division, and I first of all wanted to thank everybody for taking the time to join us today. This webinar is being recorded, as you can see, and we will be emailing you all access to it afterwards. So there's a lot of great information that Edward and Kevin here have prepared for you guys today. Our two presenters, they've been very involved in the brewery bylaw changes from start to finish. And so Edward, who's our business relationship specialist, he's with our economic development division, and he'll be going over some of the Surrey specific market intelligence for you. And Kevin Shackles, our planner here, will be diving more into the details around the zoning bylaw changes. So let's get right into it. Edward, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you and welcome, everyone. I'm extremely excited about today's webinar. It's been a long time coming for those that we've worked with in the past. Like Elizabeth mentioned, my name is Edward. I'm the business relationship specialist here at the City of Surrey. My particular role in the economic development division is really to support local businesses seeking to establish a presence here in the city, try to really identify their site selection criteria, because obviously every brewery is a little bit different, and really facilitate the right connections, whether it's with internal staff or external groups, to really get the ball rolling and help them kind of land here in Surrey. In a little bit, my colleague Kevin Shackles will also be speaking and presenting some of the details specific to the bylaw changes themselves. But I thought just as a start, I'd share some market insights with the majority of you that might really help you guys in your decision-making process when you kind of think about the next destination for your operation. So I'll ask Liz you to move to the next slide. So the city has always tracked investment inquiries. And in the last few years, what we've really seen in this is a spike in the number of breweries seeking to kind of establish a presence. But what we noticed is while the inquiries started to kind of trickle through, we recognized that some of the processes could be quite cumbersome. And so what we did is we held a roundtable and convened about 15 different breweries within the region here in Metro Vancouver, industry associations, and of course we also brought in the Provincial Liquor Licensing Board at Surrey City Hall in hopes of really identifying what some of those challenges are, and why so few breweries are located in one of the largest municipalities in the country. And what you really see here is kind of the resounding message that everyone the breweries at the time shared with us. First and foremost, we have to allow for tasting lounges on industrial zoned areas. There needs to be some work around amending some of the parking requirements. Have a very, I think, everyone also mentioned having a really clear process, or having some dedicated staff that really understand breweries and can kind of support these breweries looking to establish themselves through the municipal process. And of course, just be less restrictive than some of the other municipalities. There was a recognition at the time as well that no city is likely to be the catch-all of everything and be perfect, but really work towards something a little bit more well-rounded. And at the time, Surrey was a little bit more restrictive than some of the other municipalities, as you can imagine. So next slide. So what's exciting is really Surrey remains one of the fastest growing populations. And for those of you who have worked in the region, you know this. We have a population of, I believe, 560,000 as of February this year, and we're projected to be around 630,000 by around 2026. And in fact, what we really saw, and during the pandemic, which happened in 2020, what we actually saw was that Surrey continued to grow exponentially and very, very rapidly. Some of this we attributed to a migration of the populace north of the Fraser to south of the Fraser, when the concept of kind of work from home became more prevalent and people and families kind of required more space. The second, obviously, being kind of affordability playing a big factor in this significant move. And you can kind of see in some of these graphs, especially the one to my right with the regional context, the change in populace, actually a negative, a drop in Vancouver and an increase significantly in the kind of south of the Fraser area. I'll ask you to the next slide. So what we're seeing as well when it comes to kind of who's considering this big move, 40% are married with children, 38% married or common law without children, and 16% of them being single. But I think what's key is that a majority of this population that is moving is in the 25 to kind of 50 kind of age bracket, which talking to local breweries is kind of the target market that a lot of them are currently seeking. So that's really exciting to see. Next. As I mentioned before as well, since we have the largest population in the region in terms of space, we also at the same time remain one of the most underserved. And what you can see in this particular graph is that Surrey is one of the most underserved in the municipalities in the region when we look at breweries per 100,000 population over the age of 20. At 0.77, comparing that to our neighbors to the east in Langley that has apparently almost triple that amount. Right. So next slide. And one thing to kind of note, as Elizabeth already mentioned, this is being recorded. So after this webinar, we will share all this information, and any sort of graphs and maps that you see here, feel free to kind of put a request in, and we should be able to send that information over to you as well. Kevin will talk a little bit more about what the bylaw includes, but effectively what the bylaw now provides is additional opportunities in the industrial zoned area, specifically the IL zoned areas, the IB3s and the CHIs, which now allow for the kind of tasting lounge components to be integrated into these particular zones. The map to your left, or my left, I guess, is the yellow highlighted areas are those opportunity areas that are the CHI, IB3, and IL zones. And then to the other side, the other graph really just map shows the high growth areas that we've seen here in Surrey. So the dark blue is those high growth areas. So city center obviously being a key one, Cloverdale being a large underserved area as well as South Surrey. So I'll ask you to go to the next slide. So not only do we kind of have the space and is it more affordable neighborhoods, each one of our town centers are very kind of unique and distinct in their own right as well. So no matter the type of brewery, there's an opportunity for anyone to really establish here in Surrey. As a high level kind of overview, I've kind of picked out kind of 6 of our unique town centers. So, Surrey City Center, I think is one of the more obvious one and is a prime example. It's our downtown core where we have 2 of universities in KPU and Simon Fraser University located. And as of announcement earlier this year, UBC will also be located there as well. So you can imagine just the influx of students that we're going to see. And then just the development in the area overall. I think currently we have about 28 major projects under review and 22 major projects under construction. All high rises of that nature. So we're looking to really accommodate a young, vibrant future generation. In the city center, we also have a health tech district. We have malls, and we're expecting to hit a population of over 140,000 probably over the next 2 to 3 years. So we're expecting significant growth. We're investing heavily in the Surrey City Center, and we're seeing large players move into this area as well. So it's an exciting time there. Fleetwood is particularly exciting because those of you who are aware, we're expecting a SkyTrain line to kind of travel through Fleetwood 152nd Street and 160th Street. And so really seeing and noticing some of that transit-oriented development well underway. Applications are coming through, and so there will be these kind of attractive kind of populous areas pop up kind of in the Fleetwood community. Guildford is kind of typically where we see our Guildford Mall. There's a very young population kind of located in that particular area as well, which is very exciting. Cloverdale is particularly interesting. It's a very picturesque and heritage-focused kind of town center, but undergoing kind of explosive change in the background. It's a home to our KPU Tech campus. It will be the home to a new hospital, and it is currently where a lot of movies are currently being filmed as well. And so there's a lot of tourism that's happening in Cloverdale. And what we've seen talking to or heard talking to a number of breweries is that it's a very attractive neighborhood because there's a lot of young families that are just kind of starting off in that area with a bit more disposable income as well. Newton is our largest town center with over 154,000 residents currently, and where the majority of our smaller format industrial lands are located as well. So there are prime opportunities to be right next to kind of residential. And it's also the home to where the main KPU campus is located as well. And then finally, we have South Surrey. It's one of our more affluent neighborhoods, flanked by one of the few areas in the region left with large format industrial lands that can really service kind of large industrial uses. So if you are looking at a significant kind of investment in your brewery, that may be the destination for you. So that's all just a very, very high level kind of overview of some of our unique town centers. Obviously, we do have additional information that we're happy to share. And what I heavily suggest is after this webinar, if there are kind of specific site selection criteria or information that you're seeking, feel free to reach out to myself, Kevin, or Elizabeth, and we'd be happy to kind of address those calls kind of separately as well. So thank you. I'll turn that over to Kevin now.
Yeah, thanks for that background information, Edward. So for those who don't know me, my name's Kevin Shackles, and I'm a planner here in the Area Planning Division with the City of Surrey. I primarily process development applications for all sorts of development. But alongside my colleague Stephen Clark, who's also on the call here, we're also responsible for liquor applications through the city. So some of you may be familiar with us from going through some of the liquor applications recently. Both Stephen and I are fairly new to the liquor application side of things. So I know I've had discussions with some of you and reached out to some of you with questions. So I do appreciate some of the guidance that has been provided to both Stephen and myself as we get up to speed with the liquor side of things. But I think it's both Stephen and I do have a bit of a groundswell of support for some of these changes here, and we can definitely rely on us if you want to reach out to us with any questions about these zoning bylaw changes or about any kind of the liquor process at the city. Just next slide there, Liz. Yeah. So as many of you know, the city recently updated its zoning bylaw. That's obviously why we're here today, to allow for the lounge endorsements and the retail sales associated with the manufacturing uses. Now, before undertaking this update, the city set out a number of objectives to address in bringing these changes forward. And a lot of these objectives came from that roundtable discussion that Ed had noted earlier on in the presentation with some of you. So first, we wanted to ensure that our new policies and regulations were aligned with the provincial regulations as best as possible and within the context or fitting within the context of Surrey. We also wanted to create allowances for the lounges, both indoor and outdoor, and allow for retail sales in these areas as an outright permitted use, so without requiring a separate rezoning. And lastly, we wanted to ensure that we are addressing some of the red tape associated with these types of applications and reduce the uncertainty and costs associated with it as well. Now, I will put a caveat on that These changes are primarily related to the area planning land use process. We do still have work to do on other aspects of this, going through working with other groups like our fire services group, working with some of our engineering group, working with our building division staff, just to ensure that the process is as smooth as possible. So this is sort of kind of seen as step one in the process, but it was kind of the biggest hurdle that probably stopped businesses from coming in and locating in Surrey. And what isn't on this slide, though, that maybe some businesses may not really consider here, from the city's perspective, we are all also trying to balance the desire for lounge space, which is understandable, but with the equally important need to maintain the primacy of industrial lands, which are very important to the city and to the region. And before diving into some of the details here, I do just want to note that while the zoning bylaw itself is a fairly static regulatory document, staff are here to listen. We're here to have an open dialogue and willing to amend these regulations as we move forward. This was sort of our first kick at the can, and we do welcome feedback from all of you in terms of how we can improve these down the line, how we can respond to emerging trends. So always feel free to reach out to staff to suggest any of that, and we'd be more than willing to listen. Under the previous regulations, the liquor manufacturing was permitted under any just manufacturing use within our zoning bylaw, but it did not include any allowance for lounge or retail sales. And so that did necessitate a rezoning process, which a couple of businesses have gone through or are currently going through right now. But it does add that added time and uncertainty with council needing to weigh in on the rezoning. Next slide there, Liz. So with that, just a brief overview of the changes that we made and that we'll be discussing. So we've added 2 new uses and definitions to the zoning bylaw, and we've added specific parking rates for those 2 new uses as well. And then these uses were added to 3 different zones that are located throughout the city. And we've increased or at least or added the allowance for lounges and outdoor patios with those as well. So the 2 new uses, the first one is liquor manufacturing, and it's fairly self-explanatory. The definition does include the allowance for endorsements, and it's kind of vague in just allowing any of the endorsements. Of course, for local governments, there's only limited endorsements that we would need to provide comment on, but we were wanting to ensure that wherever the liquor manufacturing use is permitted, that those endorsements could be sought. And then the second was the liquor tasting lounge, and essentially just identifying that it is a lounge that's associated with the liquor manufacturing use. And I know there may be some concern with maybe the language around the liquor tasting lounge, considering the tasting room component through the province. And we were trying to balance sort of what made sense from the city's perspective in terms of identifying what a use would be, or what the title for the use would be, both from an administrative perspective, but also just for the public in identifying what this use actually is. So that's kind of how we structured it here. And when we brought these forward, we did look at many different municipalities and the way the uses and definitions were structured. And there really is a wide variability in zoning bylaws across Metro Vancouver. But what we do hope is that these uses are fairly clear and simple for everyone to comprehend. So previously, the city had considered breweries and lounges in much the same way as a neighborhood pub, which requires 10 parking spaces per 100 square meters. So it's quite prohibitive. But what we know is that these uses operate much differently than the neighborhood pub. And so we wanted to ensure that our parking regulations really reflected this by providing rates that weren't too onerous, but also still respected the need for parking for other businesses that may be on a site. So for liquor manufacturing, it maintains the typical manufacturing rate in our bylaw, which would be 1 space per 100 square meters of the gross floor area associated with the manufacturing component. And then the liquor tasting lounge, which previously, as I noted, was more aligned with the neighborhood pub, 10 spaces per 100 square meters. That has been reduced to 5 parking spaces per 100 square meters. And this rate, or these rates, are somewhat aligned with some of the other municipalities. It is a bit of a balance in ensuring that there is sufficient space, like I said, for all the businesses on the site, particularly in industrial area where typically 1 space per 100 square meters would be applied throughout the site. So with these liquor tasting lounges and kind of the more retail commercial component coming in, there will be a small increase in the required number of parking spaces. So we do need to respect the need to ensure that we're not compromising other businesses with the number of vehicles coming to the site. So the new uses, as Edward mentioned, they've been added to 3 of our zones. So the first is the Highway Commercial Industrial Zone, known as the CHI zone. The second is the Business Park 3 zone, IB3. And then the last one is the Light Impact Industrial Zone, IL. And so these zones are spread throughout the city in all of all 6 of Surrey's communities. But maybe what this map doesn't represent is that there are quite a number of properties that are zoned comprehensive development zone. So you may or may not be familiar with this, but there are many properties throughout the city that have this CD zoning. And essentially, these were site-specific zones that at one time or another went through a rezoning process to add a specific use or increase the density for whatever it may be on the site. And unfortunately, the way the zoning bylaw is structured, or previously was structured, was that those CD zones, which are kind of littered throughout the city, aren't updated with subsequent updates to our zoning bylaw. So there may be actually quite a few more properties throughout the city that would have been zoned either CHI, IB3, or IL, and function much in the same way as these zones, but unfortunately don't have the liquor manufacturing and liquor tasting lounge allowances within that zone. So if you do come across a zone that is zoned, or a property that is zoned CD, usually it will say what the zone is based on, whether it's CHI, IB3, or any other zone. And typically, if that's the case, I mean, an application would require a rezoning, but that is something that we would likely be supportive of, given the base zoning would align with the 3 permitted zones here. So the amendments themselves look like this. The CHI zone, which is very much commercial in nature with allowances for manufacturing, that there is no restriction on the size of the liquor tasting lounge, provided that it, of course, accompanies the manufacturing business. Now, it does allow for an outdoor patio, and all of these zones will allow for that, but there is a restriction that it is limited to 80 square meters. And this is just in recognition that there are other commercial sites on the property. There's potentially industrial uses as well occurring. And so the 80 square meters was deemed to be a sufficient size that would allow for both an indoor and outdoor tasting lounge, or tasting lounge to operate. And then in the IB3 and the IL zones, the liquor tasting lounge here is restricted to 40% of the gross floor area, or 150 square meters, whichever is lesser. And the retail area is included in that calculation as well. And similar to the CHI zone, the outdoor patio is permitted. However, in these zones, the patio is also restricted to either 80 square meters or whatever the size of the liquor tasting lounge is, whichever is lesser. So essentially, if the lounge is less than 80 square meters, then or if the allowable area based on that 40% calculation is less than 80 square meters, then the patio itself cannot exceed that amount either. So what that looks like in practice, the first example here, just noting that a property is zoned IB3 or IL zone. If the unit is sized at 250 square meters, based on that 40% threshold, that would yield a 100 square meter lounge that's permitted. Of course, the province allows that to be either indoor or outdoor. But from the city's new regulations, that would allow for 100 square meters, which we would allocate to the inside. And then the 80 square meter maximum threshold would be applied here. The second example here, if the same zoning, IB3 and IL zone, if the unit is sized to 175 square meters and we apply that 40% rate, that yields a 70 square meter interior. And because of the 80 square meters or matching the interior lounge, whichever is lesser, is applied here because the interior is less than 80 square meters. So in this case, a 70 square meter patio would be permitted. So in the context of the region, the new lounge size regulations, they're fairly flexible, as this table kind of highlights. But as I noted earlier, it's always a delicate balance between the business needs that I think all of you are looking out for, but with the city's need to balance the need for industrial land. So we do recognize some of the challenges, and like I said at the beginning, we're always happy to have conversations about how these regulations are actually working in practice. So in terms of the application process with the city, if the property is zoned IB3, CHI, or IL, there's no longer any need for a rezoning process. So essentially that process would look like this. We do ask that applicants reach out to city staff before making any kind of application. It does speed things up and allow us to identify any issues or concerns early on so that you can address them rather than being surprised by anything. So really that would start by reaching out to myself or Stephen in area planning, and we could walk through some of the requirements and take a look at your proposal before submitting that formal application to the province through the portal. And it's always a good idea as well when that application, and this is actually more for any kind of liquor application, notifying city staff that an application has been made kind of gives us the heads up that the application to the city would be forthcoming as well. So after that application is submitted to the province, the application through the city would need to occur. So that would be a liquor application. And a development permit application may also be applicable. And so a development permit application would be applicable when there's proposed changes to the exterior form and character of a building. And so an architectural drawings would need to be provided, and those would be reviewed and appended to a development permit that would eventually be issued to you. So all these things would be identified in that first step in the pre-application with city staff. And then the next step, once the application has been submitted, that would initiate the area planning review. And if you want to go to the next slide there, Liz. So once it's reached my desk or Stephen's desk or whoever comes after us, area planning would be reviewing the application. And so there's a number of things that we'd be looking out for at that time. So we'd be looking at the lounge size to make sure that it complies with the zoning bylaw. We'd be looking at parking requirements to ensure that the available parking on the site has been met. If there is a development permit for form and character, we'd be reviewing the architectural drawings. An arborist report, so that would be required if there's any construction within 10 meters of a protected tree. And then there's also a possibility of a landscape plan, just depending on the scope of what's being proposed. And then lastly, we've noted restrictive covenants here. Oftentimes there are different charges that are noted on a property, and there's all sorts of charges: statutory right-of-ways, restrictive covenants, easements. And so some of these may limit what's actually being proposed. So we do want to see that so that you aren't jeopardizing or impacting anything that may be listed on title. So that's something that we would also need to review. So once the review is completed, if a council resolution is required, so that would be whenever there's a council required component to an application. So if there is a development permit associated with it or a development variance permit, perhaps there was a variance for parking, Those types of applications would need to go to council, and so we would draft up a report, and council would review that, and typically that would take 2 council meetings. So the first one would just be them reviewing the proposal, and then the second one would be them issuing the permit and sending the resolution. If there is no council associated application, then it would simply be processed through staff, and staff would be the ones providing that resolution to the province. And so either case, the new process without the rezoning would actually run quite quickly. I think the bulk of the timeline would probably be that pre-application phase and making sure that all the issues have been identified, so that by the time that you do submit an application and area planning is reviewing the application, most of the issues have been identified, and at that point it's just kind of ticking off the boxes. So once that's all completed, the last step there is sorry Liz, the tenant improvement permit through the building division. And so we are working on improvements to that as well. We do have some very new guaranteed timelines around ensuring that tenant improvement permits can proceed fairly quickly. I'm not in the building division, so I'm not super familiar with those timelines, but I believe it was 10 weeks for a turnaround. And that's, unfortunately, that's not upon submission. That would be upon it kind of landing on the desk and the building division starting their review. However, there are going to be some further revisions to that for breweries specifically, so that there's a little bit more of a refined process, and that everyone's on the same page. Right now, that process is kind of just tenant improvement wide, so there's a wide variety of TIs that are processed through the city. So as part of some of the next steps, we'll be looking at improvements to that process as well. And yeah, so just on those next steps, we'll be looking to monitor the uptake of these regulations. And as I noted at the beginning, I mean, really that involves an ongoing dialogue with all of you in the industry, with the public, and we do encourage you to reach out to myself or to Edward or to Stephen or to Liz here if you have any suggestions, or if things aren't working. We're more than happy to take a look at things and see how we can make things work. I don't think any of us here have any illusions that this is, the ultimate or the end of our amendments to the zoning bylaw. I think we do foresee changes coming as we learn and respond to some of the emerging trends in the industry. So with that, we do have some further amendments that we would likely be bringing forward, either 6 months or to a year, where we would be looking at additional zones, some of our additional industrial zones or business park zones. There has been talk about a brewery precinct. I know there's definitely concerns with that from both the city and maybe from the industry, but it is something that has been thrown out there as well. And so, we're definitely happy to have those discussions with everyone here.
Perfect. Thanks, Kevin, for those details. And I know we reached out to you guys and to ask if you guys had any questions, and we received quite a few questions from our participants over the last few days. I'll read some of them out, and Edward, Kevin, I'll let you to decide who's going to answer them. I guess one of the first questions was, will the city be flexible on permits for serving food, such as light snacks?
Yeah. So I mean, I think we are flexible on that. We, as part of some of these updates, I think I noted like this was kind of the first hurdle is getting some of these zoning bylaw changes. There are other hurdles that we do need to get through, and work with some of the other departments and other staff to ensure that some of these things are aligned. But we are definitely flexible on the serving of food and snacks within the business. I think there would be some forthcoming changes around food trucks and stuff like that. But that's still kind of something that we need to work on.
Great. And there were a lot of questions around timelines. Specifically, what would the approval timeline look like from development permit to building permit approval and estimated timeline for brewery permits?
So I think I noted in my presentation there that the bulk of the work would be that pre-application phase, and I think that would definitely reduce timelines. Um, we do have some guaranteed timelines, and these are more around rezoning applications, and they're actually more specific to like single family or multifamily commercial projects. But if we take those as sort of a gauge in terms of timelines, um, 12 weeks is sort of like the minimum time frame for a single family rezoning application right now. That 12 weeks, it unfortunately doesn't start as soon as the application is submitted. It starts when that application comes to the area planning staff and we've given that first kind of review that everything is acceptable. So that 12 weeks is potentially something that we would be looking at, perhaps even quicker than that. I think it's part of our next step is to really flesh out the process so that everything is clear for all the consultants, all the business owners in the area. Um, but that 12 weeks is probably at least initially a good gauge for applications that don't require any kind of rezoning if you're just following these new regulations. And then I think, as I noted earlier, for the TIs, we do have those guaranteed timelines for tenant improvement permits, but they are more broad. So we do need to have some further review with our building division staff on bringing them in and bring them up to speed on this whole process so that there's some a little bit more efficiency in terms of the processing of the tenant improvements.
Great. Also, you mentioned the brewery precinct. There have been a few questions that came in around looking at Port Moody's brewery district and whether the city of Surrey is going to be focusing on specific areas and where they might be.
I can start on that, Edward, if you want, and then maybe a follow up. So right now, I mean, there has been some discussions about that for sure, and I think we've heard that before from the industry. The city currently doesn't really have any, if I can recall, any site specific zoning or like neighborhood specific zoning in place. So that would certainly be like a first, where we would be introducing specific zoning to a particular neighborhood. That being said, I mean, there's always lots of opportunities to look at. So I think that is something that we would be open to exploring if there was a level of support from the industry. But I think for right now, we were just focusing on getting the changes to individual zones.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kind of build off of what Kevin was saying, um, there have definitely been discussions. That being said, we really didn't want to be too prescriptive in our first go around and say, hey, these are the brewery district and here are the zones. We really want to take a few months, maybe up to 6 months, to really see what the interest is in general, and then really to poll industry to see where these districts might be a good destination. What I can say is if we are going to be looking at this, it would typically fall in and around our town centers. So I've talked a little bit about the Cloverdale Town Center, the Surrey City Center, those particular areas. Those are probably the areas that we would start off by looking at and then kind of going from there if that is the direction we want to take.
Great. And for people who are looking at establishing a brewery, are there any available plans to identify areas that are available for them to settle in?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start off with that one, and Kevin, feel free to jump in. So yes, as you kind of saw in our presentations, we do have the maps indicating the three kind of zoned areas and the opportunity areas there. That being said, what we do encourage is that you do reach out to myself, or Kevin or one of us on the call today to share with us a little bit more about your site selection criteria. Once we get a better understanding that all breweries are a little bit different in their own right, we'll kind of do a quick scan of Surrey and see what sort of opportunities might be a good fit as it relates to kind of some of these bylaw changes.
Great. And I guess one final question to just kind of wrap it up. This might be two in one, but people were wondering if the city would consider being landlords to breweries or whether there might be any financial incentives that could be provided.
So once again, it's not currently under our consideration in terms of financial incentives or whether or not the city would uh, consider being landlords for breweries. Obviously, like Kevin mentioned as well, we'll continue to kind of have these conversations with industry and try to get a better understanding and see where those opportunity areas are.
All right, well, I think that will wrap up our webinar for today. We did have a lot of questions come in, so if we didn't get a chance to answer yours, again, feel free to reach out to either Edward or Kevin. Both of their emails are here on this presentation. We will also send you a copy of this presentation. And yeah, thanks again so much for joining us, and we hope to continue the conversation with you.
Thanks, everyone.